All right, so today we're going to be diving into some pretty choppy economic waters.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about the potential global impact if Donald Trump returns to the presidency in 2025.
Right.
Specifically, looking at his policies on things like tariffs and sanctions.
Like stuff.
Yeah. So we've got some interesting sources to break down today.
Yeah, for sure. We've got this analysis from National Interest.
Okay.
And they're pretty critical of Trump's use of tariffs in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got this Bloomberg report that's kind of outlining some possible strategies that his administration might use if he gets back in office.
Yeah, and all of this is happening in the context of,
Right.
all his campaign promises to, ramp up tariffs.
Exactly.
There are concerns about the U.S. deficit.
Of course.
And you can't forget about what's going on with the war in Ukraine.
Huge factor.
So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack here.
Definitely.
So let's start with Trump's history with tariffs during his first term.
Okay, so National Interest, they're arguing that they weren't actually very effective. Okay. They point out that the U.S. trade deficit actually increased under those policies.
So when you say trade deficit, just so everyone's on the same page, what exactly does that mean?
So basically, it's the difference between how much a country imports versus how much it exports.
Got it.
So if you're importing more than you're exporting, you've got a trade deficit.
So kind of like spending more money than you're making?
Exactly. It's like your personal finances, but on a country level.
Okay, that makes sense.
So yeah, National Interest says that the trade deficit actually went up by 40% when Trump was using all those tariffs.
Wow, 40%.
Yeah, it's a lot.
So it seems like the tariffs didn't really, achieve what he wanted them to?
Not really. And now he's proposing even bigger increases.
Oh, wow, okay.
He's talking about 60% tariffs on goods from China.
60%.
Yeah.
It's huge.
And then on top of that, 10 to 25% on allies.
When allies, like countries that we're supposed to be on good terms with?
Yep. EU, Canada, Mexico, the whole gang.
I guess that's the whole America First thing in action, right?
Pretty much. But it could backfire big time.
How so?
Well, think about it. Those countries aren't just going to sit there and take it.
Yeah, they'll probably retaliate, right?
Exactly. They'll slap their own tariffs on our goods.
And then what?
Trade war. Everybody's putting taxes on everything. Prices go up. Everyone loses.
Yeah, nobody wins in a trade war.
No.
So, how would all of this affect, the average American?
Well, tariffs get passed down to consumers.
Okay.
So basically, everything gets more expensive. Your groceries, your phone, your car.
Oof. So not only are businesses going to be hurt by this,
Right.
but also just everyday people are going to feel it in their wallets.
Absolutely. It's kind of a lose-lose situation.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good at all.
Not really. But it's not the only thing we have to worry about.
Right, because then there's this whole other side of it.
Exactly.
With boosting domestic production and cutting taxes.
Yeah, that's a big part of his plan, too.
So let's dive into that a little bit.
Okay, so the goal there is to basically encourage companies to make more stuff here in the U.S.
Okay.
So more jobs, stronger economy, all that good stuff.
I see. So the thinking is if we give corporations tax breaks, that'll somehow trickle down and help everybody else.
That's the idea, but it's definitely a strategy that has its critics.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Some economists are saying that these kinds of tax cuts mostly benefit the wealthy and big corporations, and they don't really do much to actually boost wages or create jobs for everyday people.
Okay, so there's that side of it.
Right.
And I'm also thinking about the impact on the deficit.
Oh, yeah. Huge impact.
We already talked about how concerning that is.
For sure.
And if you're cutting taxes without also cutting spending,
Yeah.
that could really widen that budget deficit even more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a really trickle balance to strike.
So let me just get this straight.
Yeah.
Trump is aiming to increase tariffs, which could lead to trade wars and higher prices.
Right.
And at the same time, he's trying to cut taxes, which could make the deficit even worse. Yep. It seems like there's a lot of risk involved here.
There is a lot of risk, for sure.
It's like he's playing with fire.
Kinda, yeah.
And the stakes are incredibly high.
For everyone.
For everyone, exactly.
And then on top of all that,
Yeah.
you've got this whole other wild card.
The war in Ukraine.
Exactly. Yeah, it just throws a whole other wrench into things.
Right. And speaking of complicated things,
Yeah.
our Bloomberg report highlights how the Trump administration might use sanctions,
As leverage.
exactly as leverage in the conflict.
Interesting.
And not just with Russia and Ukraine,
Right.
but also potentially with places like Iran and Venezuela.
It's a tricky tool, though.
Yeah, because sanctions are powerful,
For sure.
but they can also have a lot of unintended consequences.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've already seen how sanctions on Russian oil have really messed with global energy markets.
Yeah.
Prices have been all over the place.
But what do you think the strategy is here?
Well,
Are they going to try to use more sanctions to pressure Putin? Or maybe offer some relief as part of like a peace negotiation?
so the Bloomberg report suggests a couple of options.
Okay.
One is offering sanctions relief to Russian oil companies in exchange for a peace agreement.
Okay.
And the other is basically the opposite.
So like doubling down.
Yeah, imposing even stricter sanctions to try and force Putin's hand.
Okay, so let's break those down a little bit.
Sure.
If the U.S. eases up on sanctions,
Right.
Russian oil could start flowing more freely again.
Yeah, potentially.
And that could help stabilize energy prices.
It could.
I mean, that seems like a positive outcome. Right?
On the surface, yeah, it sounds good.
But-
But there's a flip side.
What kind of message does that send to Putin?
Exactly. Does he think he can just get away with whatever he wants?
Right. And what about Ukraine?
Yeah. Would they feel abandoned by the U.S.?
Yeah, that's definitely a delicate balance.
It is.
So then what if the U.S. goes the other way and imposes even harsher sanctions?
Well, that could really cripple the Russian economy. But it would also likely send energy prices skyrocketing.
Even higher than they are now.
Oh, yeah. And that would hurt everyone, consumers, businesses, entire countries.
So it wouldn't just be Russia feeling the pain?
Not all.
Who would be hit the hardest?
Well, Europe is super dependent on Russian energy, so they'd be in a tough spot.
Yeah.
And China, which has mostly stayed out of the conflict,
Right.
they might not be too thrilled about the U.S. getting even more involved.
It seems like there are so many potential ripple effects to think about.
There are. It's a really complex situation.
And, you know, we can't forget about the ethical implications of using sanctions like this.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? It's easy to forget that sanctions impact real people.
Yeah.
We're talking about things like food shortages,
Right.
limited access to medicine,
Wow.
all sorts of hardship for everyday citizens.
So to kind of recap here,
Yeah.
we have this potential economic turmoil stemming from Trump's domestic policies.
Right.
We have this incredibly complex geopolitical situation with the war in Ukraine. And then on top of all of that, we have these ethical dilemmas surrounding sanctions.
A lot to unpack.
It's a lot.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
What happens in one part of the world.
Affects everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're on the edge of something totally new here.
Yeah, uncharted territory.
So based on everything we've learned from these sources, like, what are some potential scenarios that could actually play out?
Well, I mean, we can look back at what happened when Trump was in office before,
Right.
when he put those tariffs in place during his first term.
Right.
There was a lot of volatility in the markets.
Makes sense.
I mean, investors don't like uncertainty.
Right.
And Trump's approach to things is, well,
Unpredictable.
I could say that, yeah.
And the Bloomberg report even points out some specific dates to watch
Oh, yeah.
in February.
Right when those proposed tariff increases are supposed to go into effect.
Uh-huh.
And also when some potential new sanctions on Iran could happen.
So buckle up, basically.
Yeah, it could be wild red, at least in the short term.
Okay, so that's the short term.
Right.
But what about the long term?
The long game.
Yeah, like what are the lasting consequences of this America First approach?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
I guess so.
Like, if the U.S. really shifts away from global cooperation
Uh-huh.
and focuses only on its own interests,
Right.
what happens to the rest of the world?
Yeah.
It could have a domino effect.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Like what happens to organizations like the World Trade Organization
Right.
or NATO.
Exactly. Do they become less effective or even irrelevant
Wow.
in a world where every country is just looking out for itself?
Yeah, and if that happens,
Right.
how do we deal with problems that need global cooperation,
Yeah,
like climate change
for sure.
or future pandemics,
Exactly. Can we even maintain any kind of peace and stability?
in a world that's so fractured?
Those are some heavy questions.
They really are. I think the main takeaway for anyone listening today is that we're entering a period of immense uncertainty.
Yeah.
The decisions that the Trump administration makes in the coming months,
Or even weeks.
right, even weeks, will have ripple effects across the globe
For years to come.
for years and years.
So it's important to stay informed
Absolutely.
and really think about all the potential consequences,
Of everything that's happening.
both for ourselves and for the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It really has.
Thanks for breaking down these sources with me.
It's been my pleasure.
And for those of you listening,
Keep asking those tough questions.
learning and stay engaged.
The future depends on it.